Every evening at dusk, Sato rides the same desert trail, passing a weathered cabin where a lone dog stands guard. The animal never leaves, never approaches, just watches with eyes that seem to hold secrets. For weeks, this strange ritual continues, until curiosity finally pulls the Apache father from his path. Every evening at dusk, Sato rides the same desert trail, passing a weathered cabin where a lone dog stands guard. The animal never leaves, never approaches, just watches with eyes that seem to hold secrets. For weeks, this strange ritual continues, until curiosity finally pulls the Apache father from his path. Inside the abandoned cabin, he discovers faded drawings of wolves and warriors, a broken flute he carved years ago, and the unmistakable signs that someone lived there recently. The dog isn't guarding an empty house, it's waiting for someone to return. As Sato pieces together the clues, he realizes this forgotten place holds the key to finding his estranged son and healing wounds that have festered for too long. But what if the person the dog is waiting for doesn't want to be found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sonoran Desert stretches endlessly under a bronze sky, its ancient silence broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves on hardpan earth. Saguaro cacti stand like weathered sentinels, their arms raised in permanent supplication to the heavens. This is a land that remembers everything, every drought, every storm, every soul who has crossed its threshold seeking something they could not name. Sato sits tall in his saddle, though the weight of 58 years has settled into the lines around his dark eyes. His weathered hands hold the reins with the unconscious ease of a man who learned to ride before he could properly walk. A single eagle feather bound with red thread hangs from his salt and pepper hair, catching the last light of day. His Apache grandfather would have called this the thinking hour, that sacred time when the sun begins its descent and the desert holds its breath. The trail Sato follows is older than memory, worn smooth by countless generations of his people. It winds through Ocotillo and Palo Verde, past ancient ironwood trees that have watched empires rise and fall. This evening, like so many before, he rides with purpose but no clear destination. 3 months ago, his son Jake had vanished again, not unusual for a 28-year-old veteran who struggled with demons that had no names in either English or Apache. But this time felt different. This time, Sato feared, might be forever. His horse, a patient mare named Kaya, knows this route as well as he does. She picks her way carefully around barrel cacti and through sandy washes, where flash floods have carved temporary rivers in the earth. The desert floor crunches softly beneath her hooves, a mixture of decomposed granite and the dried remains of plants that bloom only when the rains remember to come. Sato's medicine pouch, worn smooth by decades of handling, rests against his chest. Inside, alongside the turquoise stone his grandmother gave him, lies an eagle feather from the bird that died the day Jake was born. The old woman had declared it a sign, the warrior spirit passing from one generation to the next. For 28 years, Sato had carried that feather, believing in its promise. Now he wondered if the warrior spirit had simply grown tired of the fight. The morning had started like countless others in the 3 months since Jake's latest disappearance. Sato rose before dawn, stepping quietly from the small adobe house he shared with his wife, Maria, careful not to wake her. She slept poorly these days, starting awake at every sound, hoping it might be their son returning home. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee and fry bread she had prepared the night before, enough for 3, though only 2 would eat. After his morning prayers, offered to the 4 directions, as his grandfather had taught him, Sato tended to the horses. Kaya nickered softly when she saw him approaching with the feed bucket, her breath visible in the cool desert air. 2 other horses, both geldings he had trained for the tribal police, stood waiting patiently for their breakfast. The work gave his hands something to do, while his mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. By 9 o'clock, he was at the tribal council offices, a modest building of tan stucco and red tile that served the San Carlos Apache reservation. As a council member, Sato spent his days mediating disputes, reviewing development proposals, and listening to the concerns of his people. Today brought the usual challenges: a disagreement over water rights, questions about a proposed casino expansion, and an elderly woman worried about drug dealers operating near the community center. Thomas Crow Feather, the eldest council member at 73, watched Sato with eyes that missed nothing. During a break between meetings, the old man approached with 2 cups of coffee and the measured gait of someone who had learned patience through suffering. "Your mind is on that mountain trail again," Thomas said, settling into the chair beside Sato's desk. The observation was not a question. "Every day," Sato admitted, accepting the offered coffee. "Maria thinks I should stop looking. Says if Jake wants to be found, he'll come home on his own. And what does your heart tell you?" Sato considered the question while steam rose from his cup. "That a father's job isn't finished just because his son becomes a man. That some wounds need tending whether the patient wants treatment or not." Thomas nodded slowly. "I remember when you came back from Vietnam, angry as a cornered javelina, drinking too much, picking fights with anyone who looked at you sideways. Your father never stopped believing you'd find your way back to the people. That was different. I was young, stupid. Jake," Sato's voice caught slightly, "Jake carries heavier medicine than I ever did. What he saw over there, what he had to do, it changed something fundamental in him. War changes all men. The question is whether they let it break them or teach them." The afternoon brought more meetings, more problems requiring solutions that satisfied no one completely. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sato's thoughts turned inevitably to the trail. 3 months of evening rides had yielded nothing concrete. A few reports from traders of a young Apache man who kept to himself, paid for supplies with cash, and disappeared before anyone could engage him in conversation. But the desert was vast, full of hidden canyons and forgotten places where a man could lose himself if he truly wanted to vanish. At home, Maria was preparing dinner when he arrived. She looked up from the stove with eyes that held both hope and resignation, the expression of a woman who had spent too many evenings watching the road for a son who never appeared. At 54, she remained beautiful in the way that women become when they have learned to find strength in sorrow. Her black hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a traditional bun, secured with a silver clasp that had belonged to her mother. "Any word today?" she asked, though she could read the answer in his face. "Thomas thinks I should expand the search area. There are old mining camps up in the Superstition Mountains, places where someone could hole up for months without being bothered." Maria ladled pozole into 2 bowls, the hominy and pork filling the kitchen with the scent of comfort and tradition. "And what do you think?" "I think our son is closer than we imagine. The desert has a way of keeping secrets, but it also has a way of revealing them to those who know how to look." They ate in companionable silence. 2 people who had shared enough years to communicate without words. Outside, the desert was beginning its evening transformation. The brutal heat of day gave way to the gentle coolness that made life possible in this harsh land. Night-blooming cereus prepared to unfold their magnificent flowers for one precious evening, while coyotes stirred in their dens, getting ready for another night of hunting. As twilight painted the sky in shades of coral and purple, Sato saddled Kaya for another ride. The ritual had become as necessary as breathing, a meditation in motion that helped him process the day's frustrations and focus on the task at hand. Maria watched from the kitchen window as he rode away, her hand resting on the turquoise pendant that matched the stone in his medicine pouch. The trail led north toward mountains that stood like ancient monuments against the darkening sky. Sato rode at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, allowing Kaya to find her own rhythm across the familiar ground. They passed the old windmill, where cattle gathered during the heat of day, its rusted blades turning lazily in the evening breeze. They skirted the edges of Arrow Wash, where winter rains had carved intricate patterns in the sand and left behind pools that reflected the first stars. Tonight, like every night for the past 3 months, Sato found himself thinking about the last conversation he had shared with his son. Jake had been home for 2 weeks, sleeping late, drinking beer on the front porch and staring at the mountains with eyes that seemed to see things that weren't there. When Sato tried to engage him in conversation about the future, perhaps using his military training with the tribal police, maybe taking classes at the community college, Jake had exploded with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very dark. "You don't understand what it's like over there," Jake had shouted. "You think because you went to Vietnam, you know what war is." But that was different. That was... He had stopped himself, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge unwelcome memories. "I can't be what you want me to be anymore, Dad. I'm not sure I can be anything at all." Those had been the last words they exchanged. The next morning, Jake was gone, leaving behind only a note that said he needed time to think and asking them not to look for him. That had been 3 months and countless rides ago. Now, as Kaya carried him through the gathering darkness, Sato wondered if he was being foolish to continue these evening searches. Perhaps Maria was right. Perhaps love sometimes meant letting go, trusting that the people we care about will find their own way back to us. But something deeper than logic, something that spoke in the voice of his ancestors, told him that a father's watch was never truly finished. The cabin appeared in the distance like a mirage, its weathered wood silvered by moonlight and time. Sato had ridden past this place dozens of times over the past 3 months, always noting the lone dog that stood sentinel in front of the sagging porch, always wondering about its purpose, but never stopping to investigate. Tonight felt different. Tonight, something in the animal's posture, alert but not aggressive, watchful but not threatening, pulled him from his usual path. Kaya's ears pricked forward as they approached, her nostrils flaring to catch scents carried on the evening breeze. The dog, a medium-sized mixed breed with the lean build of a desert survivor, watched their approach without moving. Its coat was the color of desert sand, marked with darker patches that helped it blend into the landscape. As Sato drew closer, he could see that this was no wild animal. Its ears were too clean, its stance too confident, its eyes too intelligent and focused. "Easy, boy," Sato murmured, dismounting slowly and keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of friendliness it had shown in all the evenings Sato had observed it. "You're waiting for someone, aren't you?" The cabin behind the dog told a story of abandonment and recent habitation. Built sometime in the 1940s as a mining claim shack, it had been constructed with more hope than skill. The roof sagged in the middle, and several of the board and batten siding pieces had warped away from the frame. But the windows, though dusty, were intact, and the front door hung straight on its hinges. Someone had been maintaining this place, or at least preventing its complete collapse. Sato approached the porch with careful steps, noting details his trained eye caught automatically. Fresh tire tracks in the sandy soil, though partially obscured by wind. Ashes in a fire ring that looked days old rather than months. A water container sitting beside the door, its aluminum surface free of the rust that would have accumulated over a full season of abandonment. The dog followed his movements, but made no attempt to prevent his approach. If anything, it seemed almost relieved to have company, as if the burden of solitary watching had grown heavy. When Sato reached for the door handle, the animal sat back on its haunches and waited, confirming his suspicion that it was accustomed to human presence. The door opened with a squeal of hinges that echoed across the desert silence. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared from outside. A single room with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchenette at the other. Someone had swept the floor recently and arranged the few pieces of furniture with care. A sleeping bag was rolled neatly in one corner, next to a backpack that looked military in origin. But it was the items on the rough-hewn table that stopped Sato cold combat boots size 11, with the distinctive tread pattern of military issue. He recognized them immediately because he had bought them himself, sending them to Iraq in a care package 2 years ago. Beside the boots sat a faded green military jacket with patches that told a story of service and sacrifice. Sato's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the jacket, inhaling the scent that was unmistakably his son's: desert dust, cigarette smoke, and something else that he couldn't quite identify, but that spoke of places far from home. On the wall above the table, someone had tacked up a collection of drawings executed on brown paper with charcoal and colored pencils. They were good, better than good, showing the kind of artistic talent that Jake had displayed as a child, but had abandoned when he reached his teenage years. The subjects were Apache warriors and wolves, rendered with the kind of detail that spoke of long hours of patient work. In one corner of the largest drawing, almost too small to notice, was a signature, J.Y. Jake Yazzie. Sato moved to the fireplace where ash and partially burned wood suggested recent use. Beside the hearth sat a wooden flute, or what remained of one. The instrument had been broken into 3 pieces, as if snapped in anger or frustration. He picked up the largest piece, running his fingers over the familiar grooves and decorative carvings. 20 years ago, he had spent weeks crafting this flute from a piece of river willow, teaching Jake the songs of their people as his own grandfather had taught him. The sound of movement outside drew his attention back to the present. Through the dusty window, he could see the dog pacing near Kaya, who stood patiently ground-tied beside a mesquite tree. But there was something in the animal's behavior that suggested alertness, as if it had heard or sensed something beyond Sato's perception. Moving to the kitchenette, Sato found further evidence of recent occupation. Canned goods were stacked neatly on makeshift shelves, their labels facing forward with military precision. A camp stove sat beside a collection of cooking utensils that showed signs of regular use. In a coffee can beside the small sink, someone had collected rainwater, though the desert's stingy precipitation meant the container was only half full. It was the notebook hidden beneath the sleeping bag that provided the most revealing glimpse into Jake's state of mind. The pages were filled with handwriting that Sato recognized as his son's, though the careful script of his school years had given way to something more hurried and emotional. The entries were dated, starting from about 6 weeks ago, and they painted a picture of a young man wrestling with demons that followed him across an ocean. Day 12 at the cabin, read one entry. The dreams are getting worse. I see their faces every night. Ahmed, Martinez, Johnson, all the guys who didn't make it home. I keep asking myself why I survived when better men didn't. What makes my life worth more than theirs? Another entry dated a week later. Saw Dad ride by again today. He's looking for me, I know he is. Part of me wants to run out there and tell him I'm okay, but I'm not okay. How do you explain to the man who raised you to be strong that you feel broken inside? How do you tell your Apache father that you've forgotten how to be brave? The final entry was dated just 3 days ago. The dog showed up yesterday. Don't know where it came from or why it decided to stick around, but there's something comforting about having another living thing nearby. It reminds me of Scout, the dog we had when I was little. Maybe Dad was right when he said the spirits send us what we need when we need it most. Sato closed the notebook and sat heavily on the edge of the rough-hewn bed frame. Outside, the dog had begun to whine softly, a sound that carried undertones of anxiety. Through the window, he could see that Kaya had raised her head, ears pointed toward the south, the direction from which they had come. Someone or something was approaching, moving through the desert with enough noise to alert the animals, but not enough to reach human ears yet. The decision came to him instantly and without debate. Jake had chosen this place for its isolation and its invisibility. If someone else was approaching, law enforcement perhaps, or well-meaning neighbors who had spotted the signs of habitation, his son would bolt like a startled deer. 3 months of patient searching would be undone in a moment of panic. Sato quickly returned the notebook to its hiding place and arranged the sleeping bag to look undisturbed. He left the combat boots and jacket where he had found them, but took the broken flute pieces. wrapping them carefully in his bandana. As he prepared to leave, his eyes fell on a piece of paper beside the drawings, a grocery list written in Jake's handwriting. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, someone had written, "Tell Dad I'm sorry." The sound of an approaching engine grew clearer as Sato stepped onto the porch. In the distance, headlights cut through the darkness, still several miles away, but heading directly toward the cabin. The dog had moved to stand beside Kaya, its tail no longer wagging, its attention focused entirely on the approaching vehicle. Sato mounted quickly and guided Kaya away from the cabin, choosing a route that would take them behind a low ridge, where they could observe without being seen. As they rode, his mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. Jake was alive, which answered the most important question. But he was also clearly struggling with psychological wounds that ran deeper than Sato had imagined. The notebook entries revealed a young man who felt unworthy of love or forgiveness, who had convinced himself that his pain was too great to share. From their position behind the ridge, Sato watched as a pickup truck approached the cabin. The dog stood its ground as the vehicle pulled up, but its body language suggested recognition rather than alarm. The driver, a figure too distant to identify in the darkness, got out and spent several minutes examining the area around the cabin before departing without entering the building. Only after the truck's taillights had disappeared into the night did Sato allow himself to fully process what he had learned. His son was not just hiding, he was standing guard over his own isolation, protected by a four-legged sentinel that had apparently appointed itself to the task. The broken flute pieces in his pocket felt heavy with symbolic weight, representing not just a damaged instrument, but a fractured relationship that might still be repairable. As he rode home through the cooling desert air, Sato began to formulate a plan. Direct confrontation would likely drive Jake further away, but there were other ways to communicate across the distances that pride and pain had created. The Apache people had always understood that some healing could not be rushed, that some wounds required patience and persistence rather than force. The dog's loyalty had given him a crucial insight into his son's character. Despite everything Jake had endured, despite the guilt and self-doubt that filled his notebook pages, he had still managed to earn the trust and devotion of another living creature. That capacity for connection, that fundamental goodness, remained intact beneath the layers of trauma and self-recrimination. Tomorrow, Sato decided, he would begin a different kind of search, not the wide-ranging exploration of the past 3 months, but a focused effort to bridge the gap between a father's love and a son's pain. The dog would be his ally in this endeavor, a four-legged messenger carrying proof that healing was possible, even in the harsh beauty of the desert. The next morning brought a clarity that only comes after a sleepless night of careful thought. Sato sat at his kitchen table, the broken flute pieces arranged before him like evidence in a trial where love and patience would serve as both prosecution and defense. Maria moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing coffee and breakfast, but her eyes kept returning to the wooden fragments that told a story she was not yet ready to hear in full. "You found something," she said finally, settling into the chair across from him with 2 steaming cups. "It was not a question. I found him. Not him exactly, but proof that he's alive and—" Sato paused, searching for words that would convey hope without raising expectations too high. "He's been living in that old mining cabin about 12 miles north of here. The one with the dog." Maria's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Is he all right? Is he hurt? Why hasn't he come home?" "He's physically safe as far as I can tell. But Maria, he's carrying wounds that go deeper than anything I understood. He's convinced himself that he doesn't deserve our love, that he somehow failed us by surviving when others didn't. That's ridiculous. Of course he deserves—" "Logic has nothing to do with survivor's guilt," Sato interrupted gently. "I learned that in Vietnam, and apparently the lesson repeats itself in every generation. The mind finds ways to punish itself that the body could never endure. They sat in silence while the desert morning painted their kitchen walls with golden light. Outside, Kaya nickered softly, reminding Sato that there were other responsibilities, other routines that required attention despite the revelation of the previous night. But his thoughts kept returning to the notebook entries, to the raw pain in his son's written words, and to the dog that had somehow become Jake's companion and protector. At the tribal council offices, Sato found it difficult to concentrate on the day's agenda. His mind wandered during discussions of budget allocations and infrastructure improvements, always circling back to the question of how to approach a son who had made himself unreachable. During the lunch break, he sought out Thomas Crow Feather, finding the elder sitting beneath a ramada behind the building, weaving a basket from willow shoots. "You have the look of a man who has found what he was searching for," Thomas observed, without looking up from his work. "But also the look of a man who realizes that finding and reaching are two different things." Sato settled beside his mentor, grateful for the shade and the old man's patient wisdom. "Jake's alive. He's been living in an abandoned cabin, hiding from the world and from us. He thinks he's protecting us from his pain." Thomas continued weaving, his gnarled fingers moving with the assurance of long practice. "The wounded warrior syndrome. I've seen it before in your generation and in mine. Men who come back from war carrying pieces of the battlefield in their hearts. How do I reach him without driving him further away?" Thomas set down his basket and studied Sato with eyes that had witnessed 8 decades of human struggle and healing. "Do you remember the story your grandfather used to tell about the wolf who lost his pack?" Sato nodded. It was one of the teaching stories that had shaped his childhood understanding of patience and persistence. The wolf wandered alone for many seasons, convinced that he was meant to be solitary, that his presence would only bring danger to any pack that accepted him. But the other wolves never stopped calling to him, never stopped leaving signs that he was welcome to return. They didn't chase him or try to force him back. They simply reminded him day after day that he belonged somewhere, and eventually he returned. Eventually he remembered that isolation is not the same as independence, that healing happens in community rather than in exile. Thomas picked up his basket again. "Your son has a guardian now, this dog you mentioned. That's a good sign. It means he hasn't completely closed his heart. Animals don't attach themselves to people who have given up entirely." That afternoon, instead of returning home immediately after work, Sato drove to the trading post on the eastern edge of the reservation. The building, constructed of local stone and weathered wood, served as both general store and informal community center. Behind the counter, Rosa Delgado looked up from her inventory with the easy smile of a woman who had spent 30 years listening to the concerns of her neighbors. "Sato, you look like a man with something specific in mind," she said, setting aside her clipboard. "What can I help you find today?" "I need supplies for someone who's camping long-term. Food that will keep, basic necessities, maybe some books or magazines." And he hesitated, then committed to the request. "Do you have any dog food? Good quality, something for a working animal." Rosa's eyebrows rose slightly, but she asked no questions. The trading post had always operated on the principle that people's business was their own, unless they chose to share it. She led him through the aisles, selecting canned goods with long shelf lives, dried fruit, coffee, and other staples that would sustain someone living without regular access to fresh supplies. "This camping trip," she said, as she rang up his purchases. "It's going to be a long one." "Could be. Not to say how long it might take for the camper to feel ready to come home." Rosa nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "Well, if you need more supplies, you know where to find me. And Sato, sometimes the longest journeys are the ones that happen right here at home." The late afternoon found Sato loading a pack mule with the supplies he had purchased, along with several items from his own workshop. He had spent 2 hours repairing the broken flute, using traditional techniques his grandfather had taught him, and joining compound that would hold even under the stress of emotional turmoil. The instrument would never be quite the same. The crack lines would always be visible, but it would sing again if given the chance. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sato set out for the cabin, with both Kaya and the pack mule in tow. The dog was there as he had expected, standing its faithful watch from the porch. But tonight its tail began wagging as soon as it recognized the approaching riders, and it trotted out to meet them with the enthusiasm of a friend rather than the wariness of a guard. "Hello again, boy," Sato murmured, dismounting and allowing the animal to sniff his extended hand. "I brought you something." He unloaded a bag of high-quality dog food and filled a metal bowl he had brought for the purpose. The dog's immediate attention to the meal confirmed Sato's suspicion that it had been surviving primarily on scraps and whatever small game it could catch. As the animal ate, Sato began the careful process of unloading his other supplies. He did not enter the cabin. Instead, he arranged his offerings on the porch, where they would be immediately visible to anyone approaching the building. The repaired flute went in the center of the display, wrapped in soft leather and tied with traditional beadwork. Around it he placed the food supplies, a few books of Apache history and contemporary poetry, a warm blanket, and a thermos of coffee that was still hot from Maria's kitchen. The final item was a letter, written in his careful script on paper that bore the tribal council letterhead. He had composed it 3 times before settling on words that felt true without being manipulative. "Loving without being overwhelming. Son," the letter began, "I know you're here, and I know you're struggling with burdens that feel too heavy to share. I want you to know that your mother and I don't need you to be perfect. We just need you to be alive and to remember that you have a place in this world that no one else can fill. The flute can be repaired, so can everything else, given time and patience. We're not going anywhere. Your friend here has excellent taste in companions." "Dad," as Sato prepared to leave, the dog followed him to where Kaya waited, looking back and forth between the man and the cabin as if uncertain whether its loyalties lay with the one who brought food or the one who provided constant companionship. The dilemma seemed to resolve itself when the animal chose a position halfway between the cabin and the horses, a compromise that allowed it to watch over both its absent friend and his newly arrived father. The ride home passed in contemplative silence. Sato found himself thinking about the wolf story Thomas had shared, about the patience required to call someone back from self-imposed exile without driving them further into isolation. The evening's work felt like a beginning rather than a solution, the first move in a careful dance that might take weeks or months to complete. At home, Maria was waiting on the front porch, her needlework in her lap, but her attention focused on the northern horizon where the cabin lay, hidden beyond the rolling hills. "How did it go?" she asked, as he unsaddled Kaya and turned her into the corral. "I left supplies and a letter. And I met Jake's companion, a good dog with excellent judgment. Now we wait and see if patience is stronger than pride." Maria folded her needlework and stood to help him with the pack mule's gear. "What if he runs? What if knowing that we found him drives him even further away? Then we'll start over and look harder." "But I don't think he wants to run anymore, Maria. I think he's tired of carrying his pain alone. The dog is proof of that. He's ready for connection, even if he doesn't quite know how to ask for it." They worked together in the gathering dusk, caring for the animals and securing the gear with the easy cooperation of people who had shared such tasks for over 30 years. As they finished, Sato looked north toward the mountains, where his son lay sleeping under stars that had witnessed countless cycles of separation and reunion, loss and recovery. Tomorrow he would return to the cabin, not to intrude, but to continue the careful process of building a bridge across the chasm of hurt and misunderstanding. Like the basket Thomas wove, this healing would require patience, persistence, and faith that broken things could be made whole again if approached with enough care and love. 3 days passed before Sato returned to the cabin, giving Jake time to discover the supplies and letter without feeling pressured or watched. When he finally made the journey north again, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert floor. and the familiar sight of the dog waiting on the porch filled him with cautious optimism. But something had changed. The animal's posture was more relaxed, its tail wagging with genuine enthusiasm rather than mere politeness. More telling were the signs around the cabin itself. The food supplies had been moved inside. The coffee thermos sat empty beside the door, and a piece of paper was tucked under a rock on the porch railing. Sato dismounted slowly, his heart beating faster as he approached the note. Jake's handwriting, though more controlled than the emotional entries in his hidden journal, still carried undertones of uncertainty and carefully guarded hope. "Dad," the message read, "thank you for the supplies and for fixing the flute. I've been watching you ride by for weeks, wanting to come out but not knowing what to say. I know you're looking for me, and I know Mom is worried. I'm not ready to come home yet, but I'm not ready to disappear either. If you want to keep leaving supplies, I promise not to run. Maybe we can figure out how to talk without me messing everything up again." The dog's name is Scout, by the way. He showed up about a week ago and decided I needed looking after. Smart animal. Jake relief flooded through Sato like water through drought-parched earth. Jake was not only acknowledging his presence, but actively choosing to stay connected. The reference to Scout, the same name as the beloved family dog from Jake's childhood, suggested that some part of his son remained anchored to positive memories despite the weight of his current struggles. Sato pulled a small notebook from his saddlebag and began composing a response. The words came slowly, each one weighed for its potential to help or harm the fragile communication they were building. "Jake," he wrote, "your mother sends her love and wants you to know that your room is exactly as you left it. She makes extra coffee every morning, just in case today is the day you decide to come home for breakfast. You haven't messed anything up that can't be fixed. Scout reminds me of our old dog, same intelligence, same loyalty to family. Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere. Dad." He left the note where Jake's had been, weighted down with the same rock, and added fresh supplies to replace what had been taken. This time, he included a book of traditional Apache stories that had belonged to his grandfather, along with tobacco for prayers and sage for cleansing ceremonies. Scout supervised these activities with the air of a diplomatic intermediary, accepting scratches behind the ears while maintaining his vigilant watch over the cabin. As Sato prepared to leave, he noticed fresh tire tracks in the sand, not his own, and not old enough to have been made during his previous visit. Someone else had been here recently, someone who had driven close enough to the cabin to examine it carefully. The discovery sent a chill through him, despite the desert heat. If Jake was trying to avoid contact with the outside world, unwanted visitors could easily spook him into fleeing. The return journey gave Sato time to consider the implications of the tire tracks. Most likely explanations included curious neighbors, county officials checking on abandoned properties, or possibly law enforcement conducting routine patrols. But there was another possibility that he preferred not to consider, that Jake's disappearance had attracted official attention for reasons beyond family concern. At home, Maria greeted the news of Jake's letter with tears that held both joy and continuing worry. She read the brief message 3 times, as if repetition might reveal hidden meanings or additional reassurance. "He sounds more like himself," she said finally. "Not happy, but not completely lost either. Do you think he'll keep communicating?" "I think he wants to." The fact that he named the dog Scout suggests he's allowing himself to remember good things about home. That's progress. What about those tire tracks you mentioned? Should we be worried? Sato considered the question while Maria prepared dinner. Probably just someone being curious about the cabin. But I'll ask around, see if anyone knows about official interest in that area. The next morning brought answers in an unexpected form. Deputy Sheriff Martinez, a man Sato had known since high school, stopped by the tribal council offices with what he described as a routine inquiry. "Sato, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you had any luck finding Jake? We've had some reports of someone living rough out in the desert, and we want to make sure it's not someone who needs help." The question was phrased carefully, but Sato caught the underlying concern in Martinez's tone. What kind of reports? Nothing alarming. Trading post clerks mentioning a young Apache man who pays cash and doesn't talk much. Hikers spotting campfire smoke in areas where camping isn't usually permitted. Could be anyone, but given that Jake's been missing for a few months, he's not missing, Sato interrupted. He's taking time to himself, working through some things. That's not a crime, last I checked. Martinez held up his hands in a gesture of peace. Of course not. I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing. It's just that if he's living out there without proper shelter or resources, winter's coming, eventually. Desert nights get cold, and if he's dealing with PTSD or other issues, he's not a danger to himself or others, if that's what you're getting at. And he's got adequate shelter. I'm glad to hear that. Look, Sato, this is completely unofficial, but if Jake wants to come in and talk, let us know he's okay. It would put some minds at ease. There are people who care about him beyond just family. After Martinez left, Sato sat in his office, contemplating the implications of the conversation. The deputy's inquiry had been friendly and genuinely concerned, but it confirmed that Jake's presence in the desert was becoming known to law enforcement. That knowledge would need to be shared, both with Jake and with Maria, so they could make informed decisions about what came next. That evening's ride to the cabin carried an additional burden of urgency. Scout greeted him with his usual enthusiasm, but Sato noticed the dog's alertness to sounds beyond the normal desert symphony of insects and settling rocks. Someone or something had the animal on edge, confirming Sato's suspicion that the cabin was attracting more attention than its inhabitant probably desired. Jake's response to his previous letter was waiting as expected, this time written on pages torn from what looked like a composition notebook. The handwriting was more relaxed, suggesting that the act of communication was becoming easier with practice. "Dad," the message began, "I found a box of my old things hidden under the floorboards, stuff I must have left here during camping trips when I was a kid. There's a wooden wolf I carved when I was about 12, and some arrowheads we found together up in the canyon. I'd forgotten about those times, about being proud of making something with my hands instead of other things. Mom always said I had good hands for creating instead of destroying. I hope she's right. Have you seen anyone else around here lately? Scout's been acting nervous, and I thought I heard a truck engine yesterday evening." Jake. The reference to creativity over destruction suggested that Jake was beginning to remember positive aspects of his identity, perhaps starting to separate his wartime experiences from his fundamental sense of self. But the mention of Scout's nervousness and the truck engine confirmed Sato's concerns about unwanted attention. His response addressed both the hopeful and the worrying elements of Jake's letter. "Your mother still has that wolf carving on her dresser. She touches it every morning when she says her prayers, asking the spirits to guide you home safely. You do have good hands for creating. That's a gift that war can't take away permanently." About the truck engine, Deputy Martinez asked about you today. Nothing threatening, just concern from people who care. But if you're feeling pressured to move on, we need to talk about other options. You don't have to face anything alone. Dad. Along with the letter, Sato left supplies that included warmer clothing and a battery-powered radio tuned to the local tribal station. The radio would give Jake access to news and music, while also providing a way to monitor any official communications that might affect his situation. As he rode home through the cooling desert air, Sato found himself thinking about the delicate balance they were maintaining. Jake was clearly beginning to heal, reconnecting with positive memories and maintaining regular communication. But external pressures were building that might force decisions before internal. Healing was complete. The challenge now would be helping his son understand that accepting help was not the same as admitting defeat, that coming home did not require being fully healed, and that family meant sharing burdens rather than carrying them alone. The wolf carving Jake had mentioned served as a perfect metaphor. Even the strongest animals needed their pack to survive the harsh realities of desert life. Scout's nervousness suggested that their A careful dance of approach and retreat might be interrupted by forces beyond their control. But the dog's continued loyalty also proved that healing relationships were possible, even in the face of uncertainty and change. If a stray animal could choose to stay and protect, perhaps a lost son could choose to trust his family with the weight of his pain. Tomorrow would bring another letter, another small step in the patient process of rebuilding trust and communication. Each exchange carried the potential for breakthrough or setback, but Sato had learned that love required the courage to keep trying regardless of the outcome. The desert had taught him patience. His son would teach him the true meaning of faith. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Sato arrived at the cabin to find not just a letter, but evidence that Jake had been watching his approach. Fresh footprints in the sand led from the cabin to a cluster of boulders about 50 yards away, a vantage point that would allow someone to observe visitors without being seen. Scout's behavior confirmed the observation, looking repeatedly toward the rocks with the expectant air of a dog whose human companion was nearby but hidden. Jake's letter that evening was longer than any previous communication, written in a hand that showed both emotional intensity and careful consideration. Along with the message was an object that made Sato's chest tighten with recognition: Maria's wedding ring, hung on a thin chain that had obviously been worn around someone's neck for months. "Dad," the letter began, "I've been watching you come and go for 2 weeks now, and I need you to know how much these letters mean to me. For the first time since I came back from Iraq, I feel like maybe I haven't completely lost my way. I found this ring in my gear when I first got to the cabin. I took it with me when I left home because I wanted to carry something that represented the kind of love I wasn't sure I deserved anymore. Mum should have it back, but I'm not ready to give it to her in person yet. I'm not ready for her to see what I've become. The truth is, Dad, I've been hiding out here because I did something terrible, and I don't know how to face the consequences. Not terrible like what I did in Iraq. That was war, and soldiers do what they have to do. This was different. This was me losing control when I should have been in control, when I was supposed to be a protector instead of a threat. 3 months ago, I was at Mickey's bar in Globe, trying to drink away another nightmare about Rodriguez and Chen. They were in my squad, good men who didn't make it home. This drunk cowboy started giving grief to a kid who couldn't have been more than 16, calling him names I won't repeat, but that had to do with his being Apache. The kid was scared, way out of his league, and everyone else in the bar was just watching like it was entertainment. I tried to calm the situation down, talk the cowboy into leaving the kid alone, but he turned on me instead, started saying things about Indians and veterans, and how we were all broken and useless. I held my temper until he grabbed the kid by the shirt and shoved him against the wall. That's when something inside me snapped. I hit him, Dad, hit him hard enough to drop him, and when he got back up swinging, I hit him again. He went down and stayed down, his head making this sound when it hit the floor that I'll never forget. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was unconscious and bleeding, and I was standing there with skinned knuckles wondering what kind of monster I'd become. I stayed long enough to make sure he was breathing, then I ran. Came straight out here to this old cabin where we used to camp when I was little, where I could think about what I'd done without hurting anyone else. The cowboy deserved what he got for picking on that kid, but I used more force than necessary. I let my anger make decisions instead of my judgment, and someone got seriously hurt because of it. Scout showed up about a week later, skinny and beat up like he'd been on his own for a while. We've been looking after each other ever since. He doesn't judge me for what I've done, doesn't expect me to be anything more than I am right now. I wish I could be that forgiving with myself. I know you're probably disappointed in me. I know Mom will be heartbroken when she finds out her son is hiding from the law like some kind of fugitive. But I need you to understand that I can't come home until I figure out how to live with what I've done, until I know I won't lose control like that again. The desert is honest. It doesn't pretend things are better than they are, doesn't offer false comfort. Out here I have to face myself without distractions or excuses. Tell Mom I'm sorry for taking her ring and that I think about her every day. Tell her that Scout keeps me company, so she doesn't have to worry about me being completely alone. And Dad, thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." Jake, reading his son's confession by lamplight in the cabin's growing darkness, Sato felt a complex mixture of emotions that defied easy categorization. Relief that Jake was finally sharing the burden he had been carrying alone. Pride that his son had intervened to protect a younger person from harassment. Concern about the legal implications of the assault. And overwhelming love for a young man who was clearly trying to find his way back to the person he wanted to be. The wedding ring lay heavy in Sato's palm, warm from body heat and worn smooth by nervous handling. He could imagine Jake touching it during his darkest moments, using its presence as an anchor to remind him that love and commitment were real, even when everything else felt uncertain. The fact that he was returning it now suggested a readiness to stop hiding behind guilt and shame. Sato's response required careful consideration. Jake needed to understand that defending someone weaker was not a character flaw, even if the execution had been imperfect. He also needed to know that legal problems, however serious, were not insurmountable obstacles to coming home. Most importantly, he needed to believe that his family's love was not conditional on his being perfect or perpetually strong. "Jake," Sato wrote by the light of his flashlight, "your mother will cry when I give her this ring, but they will be tears of relief, not disappointment. She's been more worried about your physical safety than about anything you might have done. As for what happened at Mickey's bar, defending someone who couldn't defend himself is not a character flaw. It's exactly what we raised you to do. I was in plenty of bar fights when I came back from Vietnam, son. The difference is that I was fighting for stupid reasons, pride, anger, the need to prove something to myself. You fought to protect someone who needed protection. Yes, you used more force than ideal, but you were also carrying 3 tours' worth of combat stress and survivor's guilt. A good lawyer will understand that context. Deputy Martinez asked about you again yesterday, but not in a threatening way. He's genuinely concerned about your welfare. If you're ready to deal with the legal situation, there are people who can help navigate that process. If you're not ready, we'll respect that decision too. But don't let fear of consequences keep you isolated when you're clearly ready for human connection again. Scout sounds like excellent medicine for loneliness. Bring him home when you're ready. We have plenty of room for a dog with good judgment about people. Your room is still waiting, and your mother still makes enough coffee for 3 every morning. No pressure, just information. Dad, P.S. The 16-year-old you defended was Tommy Crow Feather, Thomas's grandson. The family knows what you did, and they're grateful. Sometimes being a protector means accepting the consequences of protection, but it doesn't mean carrying shame for standing up to bullies. Sato left the letter along with warmer clothes and a thermos of Maria's homemade stew. As he prepared to ride home, Scout followed him to the horses, tail wagging but clearly conflicted about his loyalties. The dog's behavior suggested that Jake was indeed nearby, probably watching from his hiding place among the rocks. "Take care of him," Sato murmured, scratching behind Scout's ears. "And let him know that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite being afraid." The ride home gave Sato time to process the full implications of Jake's confession. The legal situation was concerning but not insurmountable, especially given the circumstances and Jake's military record. More troubling was the depth of self-doubt and shame his son was carrying. The way he had internalized responsibility for everyone else's actions, while refusing to acknowledge his own fundamental decency. At home, Maria was waiting on the porch despite the late hour, her needlework forgotten in her lap as she watched for his return. When Sato handed her the wedding ring, her reaction was exactly as he had predicted, tears of relief mixed with overwhelming gratitude that their son was alive and finally ready to trust them with his pain. He defended Tommy Crow Feather from some racist drunk, Sato explained, as Maria slipped the ring back onto her finger where it belonged. Used too much force, got scared about the legal consequences and ran. He's been carrying guilt about it for 3 months, convinced that it makes him a bad person. Our son has never been able to walk away from a fight when someone weaker needed protection, Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. Remember when he was 8 and came home with a black eye because he stood up to those boys who were picking on the Martinez girl? Same pattern, bigger stakes. He's ready to come home, Maria, but he needs to believe that home still wants him, despite his mistakes. Of course home wants him. Home has been incomplete without him. They sat together in the cooling desert air, holding hands like teenagers, while stars emerged in the vast sky above. For the first time in 3 months, both felt genuine hope that their family might find its way back together. The path would not be simple. Legal issues would need to be addressed, therapeutic support would be necessary, and trust would need to be rebuilt gradually. But Jake's willingness to share his story represented a fundamental shift from isolation to connection, from shame to the possibility of forgiveness. Tomorrow would bring another letter, another small step in the delicate process of coaxing a wounded soul back from the edge of despair. But tonight, Maria's wedding ring was back where it belonged. Scout was keeping faithful watch over their son, and the desert held all of them in its patient, ancient embrace. The exchange of letters became a daily ritual, creating an intimacy of communication that surpassed even the conversations they had shared when Jake was a child. Each evening, Sato would arrive at the cabin to find a message waiting, and each morning Jake would discover a response that continued their careful rebuilding of trust. Scout had appointed himself as postal supervisor, greeting Sato with increasing enthusiasm while maintaining his protective vigilance over the cabin's primary resident. Jake's letters grew longer and more detailed as the days passed, revealing not just the incident that had driven him into hiding, but the deeper struggles that had been accumulating since his return from Iraq. The writings painted a portrait of a young man wrestling with survivor's guilt, combat-related anxiety, and the challenge of readjusting to civilian life after experiencing the intensity of war. "Dad," one letter began, "I found something today that I want to tell you about. Hidden in my old gear, I discovered my Purple Heart. The medal they gave me when the IED took out Rodriguez and Chen, but somehow left me with just shrapnel scars and ringing ears. I've been carrying it everywhere for 2 years, but not as something to be proud of. More like evidence that I survived when better men didn't. Rodriguez had 3 kids and a wife who painted watercolors of desert flowers. Chen was going to college when he got home, wanted to be a teacher like his father. They had plans, Dad, real reasons to come home alive. And I was just a messed-up kid from the reservation who couldn't figure out what he wanted to do with his life, even before the army. The counselors at the VA kept telling me that survivor's guilt is normal, that lots of combat veterans struggle with feeling unworthy of the life they kept when others lost theirs. But knowing something is normal doesn't make it feel less real. Every good thing that happened to me, every meal I enjoyed, every sunset I watched, every moment of peace I felt, seemed like something I was stealing from Rodriguez's kids or Chen's future students. That's why I couldn't come home after my discharge. How do you celebrate surviving when survival feels like theft? How do you let people love you when you're not sure you deserve the space you're taking up in the world? The cabin has been my place to figure out whether I want to keep living with this guilt or find a way to transform it into something useful. Scout doesn't care about any of that. He just knows I give him food and scratch behind his ears, and that's enough to earn his loyalty. Sometimes I think animals understand forgiveness better than humans do. They don't carry grudges or analyze whether someone deserves kindness. They just offer what they have and accept what's offered in return. Sato's response addressed both the philosophical and practical aspects of his son's struggle. "Jake, I knew Rodriguez and Chen through your letters home. You wrote about Rodriguez teaching you to cook with whatever MREs you could trade for, and about Chen helping you study for your GED during downtime between patrols. They cared about you, son. They wouldn't want their deaths to become chains around your ankles, preventing you from living fully. Honoring the dead isn't about feeling guilty for surviving. It's about living in a way that reflects the values they died defending, protecting people who need protection, standing up for what's right, using your survival to make the world a little better than you found it. When you defended Tommy Crow Feather, you were honoring Rodriguez and Chen by being the kind of man they believed you could become. Your mother and I have been talking to Thomas Crow Feather about traditional healing ceremonies. For warriors returning from battle, our ancestors understood that men who have seen combat need spiritual cleansing to release the burdens they carry. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because war leaves marks on the soul that can only be healed through community ritual and connection to something larger than individual pain. Scouts' wisdom about forgiveness is something humans could learn from. Maybe it's time to stop analyzing whether you deserve kindness and start accepting it as a gift rather than a judgment. Love isn't earned, Jake. It's offered freely by those who choose to give it, and received gratefully by those wise enough to accept it. As their correspondence continued, Sato began sharing more of his own experiences returning from Vietnam, drawing parallels that helped Jake understand he was not alone in struggling with the transition from soldier to civilian. The letters became a bridge across generations, connecting father and son through the common experience of young men asked to do difficult things in service of causes larger than themselves. The first year I was home from Vietnam, Sato wrote in one particularly detailed letter, I couldn't sleep in the house. Every night, I'd take my sleeping bag out to the desert and find a place where I could see anyone approaching from miles away. Your mother would pack me sandwiches and coffee, never asking questions, never making me feel ashamed of needing that sense of security. I thought I was protecting the family from my nightmares and sudden startle reflexes. Really, I was protecting myself from having to explain things that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. The desert felt safer because it didn't expect anything from me except survival. Didn't ask me to pretend I was the same person who had left for war 2 years earlier. It was your grandfather who finally convinced me to come inside, not through arguments or ultimatums, but by sitting with me in the desert night after night, sharing stories about our warriors who had faced similar struggles throughout history. He helped me understand that healing happens in community, not in isolation, and that accepting help is not the same as admitting weakness. The letters also revealed Jake's growing awareness of the support network that existed beyond his immediate family. References to community members asking about him, to former classmates who had also served in Iraq and Afghanistan, to tribal elders who understood the spiritual dimensions of warrior healing. Gradually, the idea of returning home began to seem less like surrender and more like the next step in a journey toward wholeness. Dad. Jake wrote in a letter that marked 2 weeks of daily correspondence, I think I'm almost ready to come home. Not because I've figured everything out or because I don't still struggle with guilt and anger, but because I'm starting to understand that healing doesn't happen in isolation. Scout has been good company, but he can't teach me how to be human again. Only other humans can do that. I want to talk to Deputy Martinez about the bar incident. I want to make things right with that man's family if he was seriously hurt. I want to participate in the healing ceremonies you mentioned, and maybe help other veterans who are struggling with similar issues. Most of all, I want to hug Mom and tell her I'm sorry for taking her ring, for making her worry, for staying away when I should have trusted her love enough to come home broken and let her help me heal. But I need a few more days to prepare myself mentally. And I need to know that Scout can come too. He's earned his place in whatever family I'm able to build. Tomorrow, instead of leaving a letter, I want to try talking face to face. Will you stay when you bring supplies? I think I'm ready to stop hiding behind written words. Reading this message by fading sunlight, Sato felt his chest tighten with anticipation and gratitude. After 3 months of patient persistence, the careful dance of approach and retreat was finally approaching its resolution. Tomorrow would mark the first direct conversation between father and son since Jake's angry departure. The first opportunity to rebuild their relationship through spoken words, rather than carefully crafted letters. The desert evening felt charged with possibility as Sato prepared for the ride home. Scout followed him to the horses as usual, but tonight the dog's behavior seemed different, more relaxed, as if sensing that his guardian duties were approaching their natural conclusion. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound carrying across the vast landscape, like a reminder that even the most independent creatures eventually found their way back to community. Tomorrow would bring challenges and opportunities in equal measure. But tonight, the foundation had been laid for healing, forgiveness, and the patient reconstruction of bonds that war and pride had damaged but not destroyed. The next morning brought Deputy Martinez to Sato's door before dawn, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by the tense professionalism of a law enforcement officer carrying unwelcome news. Sato found him standing on the front porch, hat in hand, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Sato, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we need to talk about Jake," Martinez said without preamble. "We got a call from Globe PD last night, and the situation has changed considerably." Maria appeared in the doorway behind Sato, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips as she read the tension in both men's faces. "What's happened?" "The man Jake fought at Mickey's bar, Carl Brennan, he came out of his coma yesterday. That's the good news. The bad news is that he's claiming Jake attacked him without provocation, sucker punched him for no reason other than being white in an Indian bar. He's pressing charges for aggravated assault, and his family is talking about a civil lawsuit." Sato felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "That's not what happened. Jake defended a teenager who was being harassed and threatened. I believe you, and the bartender's statement supports that version of events. But Brennan is telling a different story, and he's got a lawyer who specializes in what he calls reverse discrimination cases. They're painting Jake as an angry veteran who attacked an innocent customer because of racial prejudice." "What does this mean for Jake?" Maria asked, setting down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "It means we need to bring him in for questioning immediately. The district attorney is under pressure to file formal charges, and Jake's 3-month absence is being interpreted as consciousness of guilt. If he doesn't come in voluntarily within the next 48 hours, they'll issue a warrant for his arrest." Sato's mind raced through the implications. After weeks of patient progress, after Jake's breakthrough decision to meet face-to-face, everything was suddenly accelerating beyond their control. The carefully constructed bridge of trust they had built through letters could collapse under the weight of external pressure and forced timelines. "What are his options if he comes in voluntarily?" Sato asked. "Better than if he's arrested on a warrant. The judge might grant bail, especially given his military record and community ties. But aggravated assault is a serious charge, particularly if the prosecutor can convince a jury that it was racially motivated. He could be looking at significant jail time, and if he runs—" Martinez's expression grew even more somber. "Then he becomes a fugitive, and everything gets worse from there. Look, Sato, I've known Jake since he was a kid. I know he's not a violent person by nature, and I know he served his country with honor. But the legal system doesn't always account for context and character the way we'd like it to." After Martinez left with promises to delay any warrant action for 48 hours, Sato and Maria sat at their kitchen table, trying to process how quickly their hope had transformed into crisis. The plan for a gentle face-to-face reunion would now have to become a conversation about legal strategy and the possibility of imprisonment. "We have to warn him," Maria said. "He deserves to know what he's facing before he makes any decisions. But if we tell him about the warrant threat, he might panic and run. 3 months of progress could be undone in a moment of fear. And if we don't tell him, he could walk into a trap thinking he's coming home to family reconciliation." The debate continued through the morning as they weighed competing loyalties and impossible choices. Eventually, they settled on a compromise. They would tell Jake about Brennan's awakening and the changed legal landscape, but emphasized that voluntary surrender offered better options than flight or arrest. The afternoon ride to the cabin carried a weight of urgency that made every mile feel like an hour. Scout greeted Sato with his usual enthusiasm, but something in the dog's behavior suggested he sensed the tension radiating from his visitor. Jake emerged from the cabin before Sato had fully dismounted, his face showing both eagerness for their planned conversation and concern about his father's obviously troubled state. "Dad, what's wrong? You look like someone died." The irony of the phrase struck Sato as he studied his son's face. Jake looked healthier than he had in months, cleaner, more rested, with an alertness in his eyes that suggested he was finally sleeping through the night. The prospect of destroying that progress with news of legal threats felt like a form of cruelty. "Jake, we need to talk about the situation in Globe. Carl Brennan woke up yesterday." Relief flooded Jake's features. "Thank God. I've been having nightmares about accidentally killing him, about his family having to live with that loss. If he's awake, he can tell them what really happened." "Son, that's not exactly how it's playing out." Sato explained Brennan's version of events, the lawyer's involvement, and the 48-hour deadline for voluntary surrender. He watched his son's face cycle through disbelief, anger, fear, and finally a kind of resigned determination that was heartbreaking in its maturity. So he's going to lie about what happened because his pride can't handle admitting he got beat up. "Defending a racist attack on a kid," Jake said finally. "And the system is going to believe him because I'm the one who ran away instead of staying to explain myself. The system is complicated, but you're not without resources. We have witnesses, you have character references, and your military record speaks to your character. But you have to be willing to fight this through proper channels instead of hiding." Jake sat down heavily on the cabin steps, Scout immediately moving to lean against his legs in a gesture of solidarity. "I thought the hardest part was going to be admitting I'd lost control and hurt someone. Now I find out that wasn't even the beginning of the fight. What do you want to do?" "I want to go home, help Mom with dinner, sleep in my own bed, and pretend none of this ever happened. But that's not an option anymore, is it?" Jake looked up at his father with eyes that held 3 years of accumulated pain and a newly acquired understanding of how complicated justice could be. "If I run now, I'll always be running. If I fight and lose, at least I'll have tried to do the right thing. You don't have to decide immediately. We have until tomorrow evening to..." "No, Dad. I've spent 3 months hiding from this, and it's only gotten worse. Time to face whatever comes next." Jake stood and began gathering his few belongings. "Scout comes with me, though. If I'm going to jail, I want to know he's being taken care of by people who understand loyalty." As they prepared for the journey back to town, Sato marveled at his son's transformation. The broken young man who had fled into the desert 3 months ago had somehow found the strength to face consequences he didn't deserve with dignity and courage. The letters, the dog's companionship, the desert's harsh honesty, all had combined to restore something essential in Jake's character. The ride home was both triumphant and terrifying. Jake was finally coming back to his family, but he was also riding toward an uncertain legal future that could separate them again for years. Scout trotted alongside Kaya, seeming to understand that this journey was different from the daily supply runs, more permanent and consequential. As the lights of home appeared in the distance, Sato found himself thinking about the wolf story Thomas had shared weeks ago. Sometimes the pack member who returned from exile was stronger for having survived alone, better able to contribute to the community's welfare because of what he had learned during his solitary wandering. Jake's time in the desert had taught him things about himself that could not have been learned in the safety of home. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and courtrooms, prosecutors and judges who would try to reduce his son's complex story to simple categories of guilt and innocence. But tonight Jake was coming home. Scout had found a permanent pack, and a family that had been broken by war and pride was finally ready to face whatever challenges came next as a united force. The homecoming was both everything Maria had dreamed of and nothing like she had imagined. Jake stood awkwardly in the kitchen doorway. Scout pressed against his legs, while his mother struggled between the desire to embrace him and the fear that too much emotion might drive him away again. The 3 months of separation had created a careful distance that would require time and patience to bridge. "You're too thin," Maria said finally. The most neutral observation she could manage, while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Desert food isn't exactly gourmet cuisine," Jake replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But Scout kept me honest about eating regularly. He's got strong opinions about meal schedules." The dog in question was exploring the house with the careful attention of an animal assessing a new territory. Scout moved from room to room, sniffing furniture and corners, occasionally looking back at Jake as if seeking permission to approve of these new surroundings. When he reached Jake's childhood bedroom, he settled onto the braided rug beside the bed with a satisfied sigh that suggested he had found his place in the family hierarchy. "He's already claimed your room," Maria observed, following the dog's exploration with bemused affection. "Smart animal. Always secure your base of operations before engaging with potential threats." Jake's military terminology felt natural rather than forced, suggesting he was beginning to integrate his service experience with his civilian identity rather than treating them as incompatible aspects of his character. The evening passed in careful conversation, punctuated by long silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Maria prepared Jake's favorite foods: green chili stew, fry bread, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, while Sato and his son discussed the legal strategy they would pursue the next day. The plan was straightforward: voluntary surrender, cooperation with authorities, and aggressive documentation of the actual events at Mickey's bar. "Thomas Crow Feather wants to testify about what Tommy told him," Sato explained over dinner. "Apparently the boy was more shaken than anyone realized, and he's been having nightmares about what might have happened if you hadn't intervened." "Good. Tommy's a good kid. Reminds me of myself at that age. Too proud to ask for help even when he's in over his head." Jake paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Always. Are you ashamed of me? For running instead of staying to face the consequences? For hiding out in the desert like some kind of criminal?" Sato set down his coffee cup and studied his son's face, noting the genuine need for reassurance beneath the carefully controlled expression. "Jake, I've never been prouder of you than I was the day I read your first letter from the cabin. Not because you defended Tommy, though that took courage. Not because you survived 3 tours in Iraq, though that took strength. But because you finally trusted us enough to share your pain instead of carrying it alone. But Iran, you took time to heal. There's a difference. Running implies cowardice. What you did required tremendous courage, facing your demons in the place where they had the most power over you, without distractions or easy comfort." Maria reached across the table to cover Jake's hand with her own. "Your father spent 6 months sleeping in the desert when he came back from Vietnam. I spent a year so angry at the world that I couldn't stand to be around other people. Healing isn't pretty, and it doesn't follow anyone else's timeline." The conversation was interrupted by headlights sweeping across the kitchen window as a vehicle approached the house. Scout immediately came to attention, positioning himself between Jake and the door with the instinctive protectiveness that had made him such an effective guardian at the cabin. Through the window they could see Deputy Martinez getting out of his patrol car, his movements suggesting urgency rather than routine. "Jake, I need you to stay calm," Martinez said as soon as Sato opened the door. "We've got a problem. Brennan's lawyer has convinced the district attorney to issue an arrest warrant effective immediately. They're saying 48 hours was too generous, given the flight risk." "Flight risk?" Jake stood from the kitchen table, his body automatically shifting into the alert posture of a soldier preparing for combat. "I came home voluntarily. I was planning to surrender in the morning. I know that, and I made that argument. But Brennan's lawyer is claiming you only came back because you knew we were closing in. That 3 months of hiding proves you're likely to run again. Martinez looked genuinely pained by the message he was delivering. I'm sorry, Jake, but I have to take you in tonight. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Scout's low growling. The dog, sensing the threat to his human companion, even if he didn't understand the legal complexities involved. Jake reached down to calm the animal while his parents processed the implications of this sudden acceleration of events. Can he at least spend one night at home? Maria asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I'm afraid not. But I can guarantee he'll be treated with respect, and we'll make sure he gets a fair hearing tomorrow morning. Judge Morrison is reasonable, and she's got a soft spot for veterans. Jake moved to gather the few belongings he had brought from the cabin, his military training evident in the efficient way. He packed essential items into a small duffel bag. Scout followed his every movement, whining softly, as if understanding that another separation was imminent. Dad, I need you to take care of Scout, and I need you to contact that lawyer Thomas recommended, Sarah Begay. If anyone can navigate this mess, it's someone who understands both the legal system and tribal politics. Jake knelt beside Scout, speaking directly to the dog in a voice that carried both affection and instruction. You stay here, boy. These are good people, and they'll make sure you're fed and loved. I'll be back as soon as I can. The drive to the county jail passed in tense silence. Martinez clearly uncomfortable with arresting someone he had known since childhood. Jake staring out the window at the desert landscape that had been his home and refuge for 3 months. In the back seat, handcuffed but not shackled, Jake found himself thinking about the healing ceremonies Thomas had mentioned, about the spiritual cleansing that warriors traditionally underwent when returning from battle. Martinez, Jake said as they approached the jail, I want you to know that I don't hold this against you. You're doing your job and you've been fair throughout this whole situation. Jake, No, let me finish. What happens next is out of your hands and mine, but I want you to know that I'm not running anymore. Whatever the legal system decides, I'm prepared to face it. The desert taught me that sometimes you have to walk through the storm to reach the other side. As they processed his intake at the county jail, Jake maintained the calm dignity that had characterized his behavior since deciding to come home. The orange jumpsuit felt foreign after 3 months of desert camouflage and civilian clothes, but he wore it without complaint or resistance. His one phone call went to Sarah Begay's answering service, leaving a message that he hoped would reach the lawyer before his morning hearing. The cell was small and sterile. Nothing like the vast openness of the cabin where he had learned to make peace with his memories and fears. But as he settled onto the narrow bunk, Jake found himself thinking not about the potential consequences he faced, but about Scout curled up on the rug in his childhood bedroom, about his parents finally able to sleep knowing he was safe, and about the fact that hiding was no longer an option or a temptation. Tomorrow would bring judges and lawyers, prosecutors and plea bargains, the machinery of justice grinding forward regardless of individual stories or circumstances. But tonight, for the first time in 3 months, Jake slept without nightmares. His dreams filled not with the faces of fallen comrades or the echo of fists striking flesh, but with images of desert sunrises and a loyal dog who had taught him that some bonds transcend fear. Some loyalties survive even the harshest trials, and some forms of love are strong enough to wait patiently through any darkness until the light returns. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, a testament to the way news traveled through both the Apache reservation and the wider community of Globe. Sato and Maria sat in the front row behind the defense table, flanked by Thomas Crowfeather and his grandson Tommy, whose testimony would be crucial to Jake's defense. Behind them, filling every available seat, were tribal members, military veterans, and community supporters who had come to show solidarity with a young man they saw as more victim than perpetrator. Sarah Begay commanded attention as she entered the courtroom, her presence radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from years of successfully defending clients in a system that was often stacked against them. At 38, She had already established herself as one of the Southwest's most effective criminal defense attorneys, specializing in cases that involved cultural context and institutional bias. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she wore a navy blue suit that conveyed competence without ostentation. Jake sat at the defense table in clothing his parents had brought from home. Clean jeans, a white shirt, and the dress boots he had worn to his high school graduation. The orange jumpsuit was gone, but the handcuffs remained. A reminder that despite community support and legal representation, he was still officially a prisoner awaiting trial. Judge Patricia Morrison entered with the measured pace of someone who had presided over thousands of cases and understood that justice required both compassion and adherence to law. At 62, she had earned a reputation for fairness and for taking the time to understand the full context of the cases that appeared before her bench. She had served in the Army herself before attending law school, a fact that often influenced her approach to cases involving veterans. Your Honor, Sarah Begay began as she rose to address the court. My client, Jake Yazzie, is here voluntarily to address charges stemming from an incident that occurred 3 months ago at Mickey's Bar in Globe. Mr. Yazzie is a decorated combat veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq, earning a Purple Heart and commendations for valor under fire. He has no previous criminal record and deep ties to this community. The prosecutor, District Attorney Raymond Carlisle, was a man in his 50s whose political ambitions had made him increasingly tough on crime, particularly in cases that attracted media attention. He had built his reputation on securing convictions and maximizing sentences, often at the expense of considering mitigating circumstances. Your Honor, Carlisle responded, the defendant stands accused of aggravated assault resulting in serious bodily injury. The victim, Carl Brennan, suffered a concussion and spent 3 weeks in a coma as a result of this unprovoked attack. The defendant then fled the scene and evaded law enforcement for 3 months, demonstrating a clear consciousness of guilt and disregard for the legal process. Judge Morrison studied the file before her, occasionally glancing up at Jake with eyes that seemed to be taking his measure. Mr. Yazzie, you're charged with aggravated assault in the 2nd degree. How do you plead? Jake stood with military bearing, his voice clear and steady, despite the gravity of the moment. Not guilty, Your Honor. Very well, Miss Begay, I assume you'll be requesting bail for your client. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Yazzie poses no flight risk. He returned home voluntarily and has strong community ties. He has family support, potential employment with the tribal police force, and is willing to surrender his passport and submit to any monitoring the court deems appropriate. Carlisle immediately objected. Your Honor, the defendant already demonstrated his willingness to flee by disappearing for 3 months. He's a trained soldier with survival skills that make him particularly dangerous if he chooses to evade justice again. The state requests that he be held without bail pending trial. The judge considered both arguments while the courtroom held its collective breath. Ms. Begay, where has your client been for the past 3 months? Sarah Begay had clearly prepared for this question. Mr. Yazzie has been staying at a family cabin on tribal land, dealing with combat-related PTSD and the emotional aftermath of the incident in question. He was not hiding from authorities so much as seeking traditional healing in a culturally appropriate setting. And during this time, was he receiving any professional treatment for his PTSD? He was following traditional Apache healing practices under the guidance of tribal elders. Your Honor, while not conventional therapy, these methods have been effective for generations in helping warriors process trauma and reintegrate into community life. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Cultural sensitivity was important in her courtroom, and she had seen enough cases involving Native American defendants to understand that healing took many forms. Mr. Yazzie, do you understand the seriousness of these charges? Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that bail is a privilege, not a right, and that any violation of bail conditions would result in immediate incarceration? Yes, Your Honor, I have no intention of running from these charges. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences the court determines are appropriate. The judge's next words would determine whether Jake spent the months before trial in jail or at home with his family. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed amplified, and Sato found himself holding his breath as he waited for the decision that would shape his son's immediate future. Bail is set at $50,000, Judge Morrison announced. The defendant will surrender his passport, submit to weekly check-ins with a probation officer, and remain within the boundaries of Gila County except for court appearances and pre-approved travel. He is also ordered to undergo psychological evaluation and to continue any treatment recommended by a qualified mental health professional. Relief flooded through the courtroom as supporters realized that Jake would be coming home, at least temporarily. Sato felt Maria's hand squeeze his arm with such force that it was almost painful. But the physical discomfort was overwhelmed by gratitude. That their son would not be spending the next several months in a jail cell. Sarah Begay was already conferring with Jake about the bail arrangements when Tommy Crowfeather approached the defense table. The 16-year-old moved with the careful dignity of someone who understood the importance of his testimony, but felt overwhelmed by the formal setting of the courtroom. "Mr. Jake," Tommy said quietly, "I wanted to tell you that I've been having nightmares about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night. That man was really going to hurt me, and everybody else was just watching like it was entertainment." Jake reached out to shake the teenager's hand, his eyes reflecting both pride in the young man's courage and pain at the memory of that violent evening. "Tommy, you did nothing wrong that night. Sometimes the world puts us in situations where there are no perfect choices, only necessary ones. I know. And I want you to know that I'm going to tell the truth about what happened, no matter what that man's lawyer tries to make me say." As the courtroom began to empty, Sato approached his son with the mixture of relief and continued worry that had characterized the past 24 hours. Jake looked older than his 28 years, marked by experiences that had accelerated his transition from young man to someone who understood the weight of difficult decisions. "How do you feel?" Sato asked. "Like I'm finally ready to stop running from my mistakes and start learning from them," Jake replied. "The desert taught me that healing doesn't happen in isolation, and hiding from consequences doesn't make them disappear. Whatever happens next, at least I'll face it with my family beside me." Outside the courthouse, Scout waited in the back of Sato's truck, his tail wagging frantically as he recognized Jake's scent on the afternoon breeze. The reunion between man and dog was brief but emotionally charged. Scout dancing around Jake's legs while the young veteran knelt to accept the enthusiastic welcome of his four-legged guardian and friend. The trial began 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, when the desert air carried the promise of cooler weather, and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun their transformation to gold. Jake had spent the intervening time working with Sarah Begay to prepare his defense, undergoing the court-ordered psychological evaluation, and participating in family counseling sessions that helped bridge the emotional distance created by 3 months of separation. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the psychologist who conducted Jake's evaluation, had been both thorough and compassionate in her assessment. Her report detailed the impact of combat trauma on young veterans, explaining how hypervigilance and protective instincts could be triggered by situations that reminded them of wartime threats. She found Jake to be suffering from moderate PTSD, but determined that he posed no ongoing danger to himself or others. Mr. Yazzi's response to the situation at Mickey's bar, Dr. Santos had written, was consistent with the protective behaviors developed during military service in a combat zone. While the force used exceeded what might be considered proportional in a civilian context, it was not indicative of criminal intent or unprovoked aggression. The courtroom was again packed with supporters, but this time the atmosphere felt different, more focused, more determined. Tommy Crowfeather sat with his grandfather in the front row, prepared to testify about the events that had triggered Jake's intervention. Several other patrons from Mickey's bar were also present, ready to provide their own accounts of Carl Brennan's behavior that evening. Sarah Begay had spent weeks building a defense strategy that would contextualize Jake's actions within both his military experience and the specific circumstances of the confrontation. She planned to demonstrate that her client had acted not out of unprovoked aggression, but from a trained soldier's instinct to protect civilians who were unable to protect themselves. Carl Brennan sat at the prosecutor's table, his appearance designed to maximize sympathy from the jury. Though he had recovered completely from his injuries, he wore a neck brace and moved with exaggerated care, playing the role of innocent victim to its fullest extent. His lawyer, Marcus Webb, was known for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to manipulate jury emotions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Webb began in his opening statement, "you will hear a simple story of unprovoked violence. My client, Carl Brennan, was enjoying a quiet drink at a local establishment when he was viciously attacked by a stranger for no reason other than his race. Mr. Brennan is a working man, a father of two, who nearly died because the defendant decided to take his frustrations out on an innocent person. The prosecutor's version of events painted Jake as an unstable veteran who had used his military training to seriously injure a civilian in an unprovoked assault, motivated by racial prejudice. It was a narrative designed to exploit fears about dangerous veterans while ignoring the context that had triggered the confrontation. Sarah Begay's opening statement offered a starkly different perspective. Mr. Yazzie is indeed a trained soldier, trained to protect those who cannot protect themselves, trained to recognize threats and respond appropriately. On the evening in question, he witnessed a grown man physically intimidating and threatening a 16-year-old boy with racial slurs and physical violence. He intervened not as an aggressor, but as a protector. The first witness called by the prosecution was Brennan himself, who testified that he had been minding his own business when Jake approached him aggressively and attacked without warning. Under cross-examination, however, Sarah Begay methodically dismantled his testimony, revealing inconsistencies and highlighting his history of similar confrontations at other establishments. "Mr. Brennan," she asked during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you've been involved in at least 3 other altercations at local bars in the past 2 years?" "Those were different situations entirely," Brennan replied defensively. "Different how? Were they not also situations where you confronted young men you perceived as different from yourself?" Webb's objections couldn't prevent the jury from hearing about Brennan's pattern of aggressive behavior, his previous arrests for disturbing the peace, and his membership in online groups that promoted racial animosity. By the time Sarah Begay finished her cross-examination, the supposed innocent victim looked more like a habitual troublemaker who had finally picked on someone capable of fighting back. Tommy Crowfeather's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the trial. The young man spoke clearly and directly about the fear he had felt when Brennan cornered him, about the racial slurs and physical threats, and about his relief when Jake intervened. "He saved me," Tommy said simply. "That man was going to hurt me bad, and nobody else was going to help. Mr. Jake didn't have to get involved. But he did, because it was the right thing to do." The jury listened intently as several other bar patrons corroborated Tommy's version of events, describing Brennan's aggressive behavior and Jake's attempt to de-escalate the situation before physical force became necessary. The bartender testified that Brennan had been drinking heavily and making racist comments throughout the evening, creating an atmosphere of tension that had made other customers uncomfortable. Dr. Santos took the stand to explain the psychological factors that had influenced Jake's response to the confrontation. Her testimony helped the jury understand how combat veterans sometimes reacted to threatening situations with responses that seemed excessive to civilians but were appropriate to the training they had received. Mr. Yazzie was not acting out of anger, or prejudice. Dr. Santos explained. He was responding to a perceived threat against a vulnerable person using the protective instincts that had been reinforced through years of military service in combat zones. The final witness for the defense was Jake himself, who testified about his military service, his struggles with readjustment to civilian life, and his decision to intervene when he saw Tommy being threatened. His testimony was both humble and dignified, acknowledging that he had used more force than ideal, while maintaining that his primary motivation had been protecting someone who needed protection. "I wish I could have resolved the situation without anyone getting hurt," Jake said in response to Sarah Bigay's questioning. "But I couldn't stand by and watch a grown man terrorize a kid who was just trying to mind his own business. My grandfather taught me that a man's worth is measured by his willingness to protect those who can't protect themselves." The closing arguments summarized the competing narratives that the jury would need to resolve. Webb portrayed Jake as a dangerous veteran whose military training made him a threat to innocent civilians. Sarah Bigay painted him as a young man who had made a split-second decision to protect someone weaker, using the skills his country had taught him in service of his community's values. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Jake sat quietly at the defense table, Scout lying at his feet in a gesture of loyalty that had become familiar to courtroom observers. The waiting would be difficult, but Jake had learned patience during his months in the desert, and he faced the uncertainty of the verdict with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire approach to the legal process. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber as Sato and Jake rode side by side along the familiar trail that had become the pathway to healing for both father and son. Scout trotted alongside Kaya, having learned to pace himself for the longer rides that had become a cherished family tradition. The old cabin stood empty now, its purpose served, but they still passed it each evening as a reminder of how far they had traveled from those dark months of separation and uncertainty. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The decision surprised no one who had followed the trial closely. The evidence of Jake's character and Brennan's history of aggressive behavior had made the choice clear. But more important than the legal vindication was the healing that had taken place in the months that followed. Jake now worked part-time with the tribal police, using his military experience and hard-won wisdom to help other veterans struggling with the transition from soldier to civilian. He had also become a regular speaker at high schools on and off the reservation, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the importance of dealing with trauma before it erupted into crisis. Tommy Crowfeather started college this fall, Jake mentioned, as they crested a low hill that offered a panoramic view of the desert valley. His grandfather says he's studying criminal justice, wants to become a lawyer like Sarah Bigay. Good for him. That boy showed real courage during the trial. Sato adjusted his reins as Kaya picked her way around a cluster of barrel cacti. "Speaking of courage, your mother has been talking about grandchildren again." Jake laughed, the sound carrying none of the bitterness that had characterized his humor in the months immediately following his return from Iraq. "I figured she would. I've been thinking about that myself, actually. There's a teacher at the tribal school, Elena Martinez, Deputy Martinez's daughter. We've been having coffee together, and I'm learning that healing isn't something you complete like a mission. It's something you keep working on day by day, with people who care enough to be patient while you figure things out." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. The legal battles were behind them, the family wounds were healing, and Jake had found a way to transform his painful experiences into service to his community. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned to accept help instead of insisting on carrying every burden alone. The cabin where Jake had spent 3 months in self-imposed exile now served a different purpose. With help from tribal youth services, they had converted it into a retreat center for young Apache veterans dealing with readjustment issues. Jake led monthly gatherings there, sharing traditional healing practices alongside contemporary therapy techniques. The combination of ancient wisdom and modern understanding proved remarkably effective for young men and women trying to reconcile their military service with their cultural identity. Dr. Santos thinks the veteran support group is ready to expand, Jake said as they turned toward home. She wants to partner with the tribal college to offer formal counseling services. What do you think? I think Rodriguez and Chen would approve. Instead of carrying survivor's guilt, I'm using my survival to help others survive. That feels like honoring their memory in a way that actually matters. As they approached the house, they could see Maria hanging laundry on the line, Scout's favorite rope toy among the items dancing in the desert breeze. The sight of domestic normalcy filled both men with contentment that had been hard-won through months of patience, forgiveness, and the gradual rebuilding of trust. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the three of them sat on the front porch sharing coffee and Maria's fresh-baked bread. Scout lay stretched across Jake's feet, having appointed himself as permanent guardian despite the obvious security of their surroundings. The dog had gained weight and glossy health during his months as a family pet, but he had never lost his protective instincts toward the young veteran who had earned his loyalty in the harsh honesty of the desert. "Elena's coming for dinner on Sunday," Jake announced, breaking a comfortable silence. "I thought it was time for her to meet the family officially." Maria's face lit up with the kind of joy that comes from seeing a beloved child embrace the possibility of happiness. "Should I make extra food?" "Definitely. And maybe we should warn her about Scout's interview process. He takes his guard dog responsibilities very seriously, as if understanding the conversation." Scout lifted his head to study Jake with the intelligent gaze that had first convinced the young veteran that some connections transcended species and circumstance. The dog's presence in their lives had become a reminder that loyalty, patience, and unconditional love could transform even the most damaged souls. Later that night, after Maria had gone to bed and Jake was settling into his old room, Sato took out the wooden flute they had repaired together during the early days of their correspondence. The instrument bore visible scars from its time broken in the cabin, but the music it produced was sweeter for having been restored with care and love. The melody he played was one his grandfather had taught him, a song about warriors returning from battle, about the community that waits to welcome them home, and about the healing that happens when isolation gives way to connection. From his bedroom window, Jake could hear the music drifting across the desert air, carrying messages of forgiveness, hope, and the patient love that makes redemption possible. Scout lifted his head from the rug beside the bed, ears pricked toward the sound, then settled back into sleep with the satisfied sigh of an animal whose work was complete. The desert night enveloped the house in its ancient silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through Ocotillo and the distant call of a coyote to its pack. In the morning, there would be work to do, people to help, and the ongoing process of building a life worthy of the second chances they had all been given. But tonight, a father and son slept peacefully under stars that had witnessed countless cycles of loss and recovery. Separation and reunion, brokenness and the patient love that makes all healing possible. The cabin stood empty on the northern horizon, its purpose fulfilled, but its lessons enduring. Sometimes the longest journeys happen close to home. Sometimes the strongest medicine comes from the willingness to accept help. And sometimes the most loyal companions arrive as strays who choose to stay because they recognize something worth protecting in the damaged souls they encounter. Scout's vigil was over, but his example of faithful presence continued to remind them all that love, once offered freely, creates bonds that can survive any darkness and guide lost souls back to the light of community, purpose, and hope.